We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal. Thomas Jefferson wrote that. He later went home to his plantation with its 150 slaves. You've probably heard of Thomas Jefferson, most likely from a history teacher. He's just one of those guys you hear about in 5th grade, and then probably forget about until some politician brings him up on the news with an appeal to return to what the founding fathers would have wanted. However, Thomas Jefferson is neither an untouchable icon nor a distant historical figure. His lofty ideals often clashed with practical concerns, and the contradictions between his thoughts and his actions paint the picture of a fascinating and flawed human being. There are lots of little contrasts in Jefferson's life. For instance, he was a very private man with a noted aversion to public speaking. However, he also went on to run for the presidency successfully, twice. He wanted a very high standard of living for himself, inspired by the great architecture he saw in France. So he spent 10 years remodeling his mansion and thus spent a decade living in a construction site. He is often considered very remarkable for composing the Declaration of Independence. But at the time, he was only assigned to write the Declaration of Independence because the rest of the Continental Congress had better things to do. And because he was pressed for time, he composed it largely by copying ideas and wording from his own previous writing and from the new Virginia Constitution. So essentially, the Declaration of Independence was the product of an all-nighter. And like any hastily composed paper, there were heavy edits after he turned it in. These little details paint a more interesting picture than the quotes and statues will tell you. But it is still true that Thomas Jefferson had a very sharp mind and big ideas. He was an idealist and preferred to see things in pure black and whites. His view of the world led him to realize that slavery was untenable in the long run. He was also in favor of agrarianism, which is the idea that the country should be sustained by small, independent farmers who owned their own land, rather than a rich upper class that bought the work of the poor people. He was also in favor of an idea called pure republicanism, which is the idea that the government should be strictly limited to the powers laid out in the Constitution, rather than being able to expand its powers as it desired. This put a strong emphasis on personal liberties and also ties in with his strong stance for religious freedom. These are the sorts of ideals that make Jefferson a very popular figure. However, his actions often contradicted those principles on many points. For instance, his ideas about limited government clashed with his vision of an ideal agrarian society when he was offered the opportunity to buy a large section of land that later became the Louisiana Purchase. If he had followed his principles, he would have decided that the Constitution did not allow the U.S. government to buy land, and thus rejected the offer. But he held his nose and went ahead and made the deal anyway. He was often touting the valuableness of independent farmers to the nation's economy and development, but he himself was not particularly interested in farming, failed miserably at it on his plantation, and despite having an image of being a man of the common people, he had the tastes of an aristocrat, buying luxury goods even during an embargo during the American Revolution. He purchased a fancy piano from Britain and excused it by saying that he wouldn't use it until the boycott was over. This taste for luxury got him into deep debt in his later years, and he was only able to pay those debts by having his slaves work long hours manufacturing nails, an eerie echo of the child labor in the European factories he so despised. And of course, this brings me to my final point, that despite his early vehement writings against slavery and his recognition that it needed to end, he himself was financially dependent on slavery and even calculated the gains that it was bringing to him. And it was perhaps this realization that made him less and less vocal about it in his later years. He also did not think of white people and black people as being capable of existing together as equals. His opinion was that black people would resent white people for slavery, and white people would retain prejudices against black people. A surprisingly poignant echo of what actually later happened with racial tension. The flaws I've outlined might make Jefferson lose some of the shininess great historical figures tend to have. But Thomas Jefferson didn't live with the idea that he would be enduringly famous. He was just an ordinary, if influential man. And although the flaws he had may be unbecoming of an immortal paragon, they are more than understandable in an actual human. Hopefully now you'll be able to see Jefferson less as the denizen of dusty and dry textbooks, and more as an actual person with all the complexities and imperfections that comes with. And maybe you'll also realize it might be a good idea to avoid needing slaves to pay your debts. Just a thought.
More questions for Isaac?
What made you choose this as a topic?
In a previous history class, the teacher briefly went over some of the things about Jefferson's life, and it was really interesting, and he struck me as a fascinating guy, so I thought the topic could use some looking into.
So you're saying that the Declaration of Independence should have a works cited page to it?
Perhaps.
So basically, you're saying is he made like how we do homework overnight. That means he made the Constitution overnight.
He did compose it pretty hastily, and it makes sense at the time, because at the time it wasn't really considered too important. It's just now that everyone considers it a big thing, we should still keep in mind its origins.
Okay.